There is a river in South America so wide, so deep, so overwhelmingly alive that the scientists who have spent their entire careers studying it will tell you, quietly and without drama, that they still do not fully understand it. Not the fish, not the plants, not the insects, not the chemistry of the water itself. And certainly not everything that lives beneath the surface of that water, moving in the darkness, hunting in the darkness, existing in the darkness at a scale that the human mind genuinely struggles to accommodate. Because there is something in the Amazon River, and in the flooded forests and the Blackwater channels, and the oxbow lakes that branch off it like the fingers of a hand pressed into mud, something so large and so ancient, and so perfectly designed by millions of years of evolution that when you encounter it, when you actually see the full length of it moving through the water with that slow, deliberate, almost contemptuous power, your body reacts before your brain has time to form a single coherent thought. The green anaconda is the largest snake on Earth. Not the longest, though it is among the longest. The largest, the heaviest, the most massive, the one that, when full grown and in its element, represents something so far outside the normal parameters of what we expect a living animal to look like that it sits in a category almost by itself. And the Amazon is its home, its kingdom, its entire universe, and the story of how it came to be what it is, and how it lives, and what it does in the dark water and the flooded forest and the still oxbow lakes where the surface looks like a mirror and nothing seems to be moving until something very much is. That story is one of the most extraordinary things the natural world has produced. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the Amazon the way it actually is, not the highlight reel, not the 30-second clip of something dramatic happening in a clearing, but the deep reality, the slow reality, the reality that took millions of years to build and that most people will never get close enough to truly see. Let us go. To understand the anaconda, you have to first understand the Amazon, because the anaconda is not just an animal that happens to live in the Amazon the way a sparrow happens to live in a park. The anaconda is an expression of the Amazon. It is what the Amazon produced when you give evolution enough water, enough prey, enough heat, and enough time. The two things are inseparable, and you cannot understand one without understanding the other. The Amazon basin covers approximately 7.4 million square kilometers, which is a number that means very little until you start trying to put it in context. It is larger than the continental United States minus Alaska. It contains approximately 10% of all species on Earth, which is a figure so extreme it sounds like an error but is not. It receives somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 millimeters of rainfall per year depending on location, and the river itself, the Amazon proper plus all of its tributaries and subtributaries, discharges approximately 20% of all fresh water that enters the world's oceans from all rivers combined. One river system, 20% of the world's freshwater river discharge. The scale of this is not metaphorical. It is a physical fact about the planet we live on. The Amazon floods. This is a crucial thing to understand because the flooding of the Amazon is not a disaster and it is not an anomaly. It is the central organizing event of the entire ecosystem. Every year the rains come and the river rises not by a meter or two but by 10, 12, sometimes 15 meters in some locations. The forest floods. The trees that line the river, species that have evolved specifically to withstand months of inundation, stand with their trunks and lower branches submerged. The fish swim between the trees. The birds nest above the waterline, and the things that live in the water move into the forest following the flood, hunting in a habitat that did not exist 6 months ago and will not exist 6 months from now. This flooded forest, the Varzea in the whitewater regions and the Agapo in the blackwater regions, is one of the most productive and complex habitats on Earth, and it is temporary. It appears and disappears on an annual cycle, and everything that lives here has built its life around that cycle. The anaconda has built its life around the cycle more completely than almost anything else in the system. It is a creature of the water's edge, of the flooded margins, of the shallow lakes and the still channels and the reed beds and the muddy banks where the terrestrial and aquatic worlds blur into each other. It is not, despite the image that most people carry in their heads, a creature of the deep river. It is a creature of the margins. Of the places where the water is warm and shallow and the prey is dense and the vegetation is thick enough to provide cover. Of the places where the flood creates opportunity. Let us talk about size, because size is where every conversation about the anaconda begins and where most of them get immediately confused by exaggeration and mythology. The green anaconda, Unex murinus, is legitimately the heaviest snake on Earth. The maximum reliably recorded weights are in the range of 200 to 250 kilograms. The maximum reliably recorded lengths are in the range of 7 to 8 meters. With exceptional individuals possibly reaching 9 meters, though the reports of 10, 11, and 12-meter anacondas that circulate in popular literature, and in the accounts of explorers past and present, are almost certainly exaggerations produced by the same psychological mechanism that causes every fisherman everywhere to add a foot to the length of the one that got away. But here is the thing, even without the exaggeration, the reality is astonishing. A snake 7 meters long and weighing 200 kilograms is a reality so far outside normal animal parameters that the exaggeration is almost understandable. Because when you see one, when you actually see a large adult anaconda in the water, the first thing your brain does is refuse the information. It tells you that what you're looking at cannot be a single animal. It is too big. It takes up too much space. The coils of it, the sheer volume of the animal as it moves through the water or rests half submerged in the shallows, trigger something very old and very primal in the human nervous system. Something that got encoded there a very long time ago when our ancestors shared landscapes with large constrictors, and the ability to recognize and respond to them quickly was the difference between surviving the afternoon and not. The green anaconda is sexually dimorphic in one of the most extreme ways of any non-marine vertebrate. The females are dramatically larger than the males. This is the opposite of the pattern in most large animals, where males are typically larger, often because size and strength are advantages in competition for mates. In anacondas, the pattern is reversed. The females can be 5 or more times heavier than the males. A large female might weigh 100 kilograms while the males she mates with might weigh 10 or 15. The reasons for this are not fully understood, though the most compelling hypothesis relates to reproduction. Anacondas give birth to live young rather than laying eggs, and the size of the female directly determines how many offspring she can carry and how large those offspring will be when born. A larger female produces more and larger young, and in an environment where the first year of life is extraordinarily dangerous, and most young anacondas will not survive it, being born larger gives a young snake a genuine survival advantage. The extreme sexual dimorphism of the anaconda may therefore be a product of extraordinarily strong selective pressure on female body size operating over millions of years. The color of a green anaconda is one of the things that seems least impressive in photographs and most impressive in reality. In photographs, they look olive green with dark spots, which is accurate as a description of the pattern but completely fails to capture what the skin actually looks like when you see it close up and in the right light. The scales of an anaconda have a quality that is almost iridescent, a subtle sheen that shifts as the animal moves, the olive and green and brown tones catching light in a way that makes the skin look like it is slightly luminous. The pattern of dark spots, rounded and irregular, is not random. It is a disruption pattern, the same principle that makes military camouflage work, breaking up the outline of the body into shapes that do not read as snake when viewed through the dappled light and shadow of a flooded forest or the reed beds at the edge of a still lake. Up close, a large anaconda is an extraordinarily beautiful animal. In the way that all things that are perfectly adapted to their purpose are beautiful, where form and function have been reconciled so completely that there is nothing extraneous, nothing wasted, nothing out of place. The head of an anaconda is heavy and blunt and wide, with eyes and nostrils positioned on the top of the skull rather than the sides, which is a water-adapted arrangement that allows the snake to be almost completely submerged while still being able to see and breathe. This is not a coincidence of anatomy. This is a specific evolutionary solution to a specific ecological problem. How do you ambush prey that comes to the water's edge to drink when you are a very large predator that needs to be invisible until the moment it is not? The answer is to make yourself flat, to make yourself part of the surface, to lie in the shallows with only the top of your head above the waterline, breathing, watching, waiting for as long as it takes. The anaconda is not an active pursuit predator. It does not chase, it does not run down prey. It does not have the metabolic machinery for sustained high-energy activity because it does not need it. It is an ambush predator, and ambush predation at the scale the anaconda operates requires patience so extreme that it begins to look, to a human observer, like total inactivity. An anaconda can remain motionless in the water for hours, days. It can wait in one spot, barely moving, barely breathing in any visible sense until something comes to it. And in the Amazon, in the flooded forests and the reed beds and the river margins, something always eventually comes. The Amazon is too alive, too dense with prey for a large predator to wait long without reward. When prey comes, the speed of what happens next is the thing that observers consistently report as the most shocking aspect of anaconda predation. The stillness and the explosion of movement are so completely opposed to each other that the mind struggles to connect them as actions by the same animal. One moment the water is still, the next the snake has moved. The strike of an anaconda is not a lunge in the way that some terrestrial constrictors lunge, launching the head and the front part of the body toward the prey. An anaconda strike involves the whole body. the entire mass of the animal redirecting toward the target with a speed that seems physically impossible for something so heavy, driven by muscles that have had millions of years of evolutionary pressure to maximize the speed and force of this single action. Because the anaconda gets one strike. If it misses, the prey is gone. Everything the anaconda has been built around not missing. The anaconda grabs prey with its teeth, which are curved backward and numerous and designed not to kill but to hold. To prevent escape, the anaconda does not have venom. It does not need venom. What it has instead is constriction, and constriction at the scale the anaconda operates is one of the most efficient killing mechanisms in the animal kingdom. The coils of the anaconda wrap around the prey immediately after the strike, and then they tighten. But not, as is commonly believed, to crush the prey to death. The old understanding of constriction was that the snake squeezed until it broke bones and ruptured organs, which occasionally happens but is not the mechanism of death. The actual mechanism, which researchers have only clarified in relatively recent decades, is circulatory. The constriction of an anaconda's coils is precisely calibrated to exceed the blood pressure of the prey's heart. Every time the prey's heart beats, the coils tighten fractionally more. The prey cannot get blood to its brain, it loses consciousness within seconds. It is dead within minutes. It never escapes. The anaconda's coils are a feedback system, sensing the heartbeat of the prey and responding to it, tightening with each beat until there are no more beats to respond to. This is not cruelty. Cruelty requires intention. What this is efficiency. The anaconda does not waste energy. It does not thrash and tear. It squeezes and it tightens and it waits, and when it is finished the prey is dead with a minimum of effort expended by the snake. And then comes the eating, which is its own kind of extraordinary. The jaw of a snake is not hinged the way a mammalian jaw is hinged. The bones of the lower jaw are connected to each other and to the skull by highly elastic ligaments that allow the mouth to open to an angle and a width that would be completely impossible for any bone-to-bone joint. An anaconda can open its mouth wide enough to swallow prey considerably larger in diameter than the snake's own head. The swallowing process involves the two sides of the lower jaw moving independently of each other, a ratcheting motion that walks the prey backward into the throat while the muscles of the throat and body do the work of moving it further down. Large prey, a large capybara or a caiman or a deer, can take an hour or more to swallow completely. During this time the anaconda is at its most vulnerable, weighted down, temporarily slow, unable to defend itself effectively. This is why anacondas typically find somewhere safe and secluded to eat, a dense patch of vegetation, a shallow pool where they can remain mostly submerged, somewhere away from the open water where they would be exposed. After eating something very large, an anaconda may not need to eat again for weeks, months in some recorded cases. This is the metabolic reality of ectothermy combined with extreme dietary efficiency. The anaconda does not burn calories maintaining a constant body temperature the way mammals do. A human being or a jaguar burns an enormous fraction of its daily caloric intake simply staying warm. The anaconda burns almost nothing on thermoregulation. Everything it eats goes to growth, to reproduction, to maintaining the basic functions of the body. This is why ectotherms can survive on diets that would be impossible for mammals of equivalent size, and it is why the anaconda, despite its enormous body, does not need to kill constantly to sustain itself. It kills when it can, it eats everything it can hold, and then it rests and digests and waits. What does the anaconda eat? The short answer is, anything it can catch that is not too large to swallow. The practical answer is more specific and more interesting. The primary prey of large adult anacondas in the Amazon includes capybaras, which are the world's largest rodents and which can weigh 60 or 70 kilograms, making them a substantial but manageable target for a very large snake. Caimans, particularly the smaller spectacled caiman, which shares the anaconda's preference for shallow water and slow rivers and which the anaconda encounters regularly in its habitat. Deer, specifically the marsh deer and the brocket deer that come to the water's edge to drink. Large birds, including the giant anteater on occasion. Peccaries, the wild pig relatives of the Amazon, which are common and numerous and which come to water regularly. Fish, surprisingly often, which the anaconda catches by remaining still in shallow water until fish come close enough to grab. Turtles, other snakes, and in some documented cases other anacondas. This last point deserves more than a passing mention. Cannibalism has been documented in green anacondas, and it is not rare enough to be considered an aberration. Large females have been found with the remains of smaller individuals in their stomachs. This sounds dramatic and is typically reported that way in popular media, but it is actually a fairly logical consequence of the anaconda's ecological position and its dietary opportunism. A very large female anaconda, assessing a prey item of appropriate size, does not necessarily have the cognitive equipment to distinguish between a capybara and a smaller conspecific in the way that more socially and cognitively complex animals might. Prey is prey. Size and edibility are what matter. In an environment where large protein packages are always worth pursuing, the species of the protein package may simply not be a relevant variable. The mating of green anacondas is one of the most dramatic reproductive events in the reptile world, and it is barely visible even to researchers who specifically seek it out, because it happens in the shallow water and the dense vegetation of anaconda habitat, slowly and with very little outward drama over a period of weeks. During breeding season, which varies by location but is typically in the dry season or early wet season, female anacondas release chemical signals, pheromones, into the water and into the substrate around them, advertising their reproductive readiness. And the males come, multiple males, sometimes many males, following the chemical trail through the water, tracking the female over long distances through flooded forest and open channel alike until they find her. What happens next is called a breeding ball, and it is one of those animal behaviors that sounds mythological but is entirely factual and has been observed and documented by researchers in the wild. Multiple males, sometimes as many as a dozen, coil around a single large female in a writhing mass that can persist for days or even weeks. The female is in the center, and the males compete, not through aggression or open fighting as many mammals compete for mates, but through a slower, more sustained form of muscular competition, pressing against each other and against the female, each male attempting to align himself with the female in the correct position for mating while the others attempt to displace him. The whole thing looks, from a distance, like a single enormous amorphous creature moving very slowly through the water, and it has presumably given rise to some of the more extreme accounts of giant anacondas that populate the folklore of the Amazon basin. Female ultimately mates with one or multiple males from the group, and it is not fully understood what determines which males succeed. Body size seems to play a role, as does persistence, but the female also appears to have some agency in the process, though how that agency is exercised in an organism with the neural architecture of a snake is a question that behavioral researchers have not definitively answered. What is clear is that the reproductive investment is heavily skewed toward the female. She will carry the developing young inside her for 6 to 7 months. During this time, she eats little or nothing, depending entirely on her fat reserves to sustain both herself and the developing offspring. A large female entering this period in poor condition may not survive the pregnancy or may give birth to smaller or fewer young. The stakes of successful mating are much higher for her than for any of the males she mated with, and this asymmetry in reproductive investment may be another driver of the extreme sexual dimorphism that makes female anacondas so much larger than males. When the young are born, they arrive not as eggs but as fully formed miniature anacondas, each one 60 to 80 centimeters long at birth, which sounds small but is actually quite large for a newborn snake, and each one is immediately independent. The mother does not protect them, she does not feed them, she does not teach them anything. She gives birth, and within hours or days she is gone, back into the water, the enormous expenditure of the pregnancy completed, eating aggressively now to replenish what she has spent. The young anacondas disperse into the flooded forest and the reed beds and the margins of the river, and they begin the most dangerous period of their lives. In the first year of life, a young anaconda is prey to an extraordinary array of animals that it will one day utterly dominate. Large wading birds, herons and jabiroos and storks take young anacondas from the shallows with the same casual efficiency that they apply to fish and frogs. Caimans take them. Large fish take them. Other snakes take them. Even adult male anacondas may take them opportunistically. The 30 or 40 young produced by a large female in a single birth, relatively few will survive to their second year. And of those that do, fewer still will survive to the size at which they begin to become genuinely dangerous to other animals. The early years of an anaconda's life are a gauntlet of vulnerability from which the survivors emerge, hardened and efficient, and beginning the slow growth toward the dimensions that will eventually make them the dominant predators of their habitat. Growth in anacondas is continuous throughout their lives. They do not stop growing when they reach adulthood the way most vertebrates do. They simply grow more slowly as they get older. This means that a very large anaconda is almost certainly a very old anaconda, an individual that has survived for decades in an environment that kills most of its relatives in their first years. The largest anacondas on record, the ones that approach or exceed 7 meters and 150 or 200 kilograms, are survivors of extraordinary duration, animals that have navigated the gauntlet of juvenile vulnerability and the pressures of adult life for 20, 25, perhaps 30 years in one of the most biologically competitive environments on Earth. What threatens an adult anaconda? The honest answer is not much. A very large adult female anaconda has essentially no natural predators. She is too large, too powerful, and too well defended for most things in the Amazon to consider attacking. The jaguar, which shares the anaconda's preference for waterside habitats, and which is the apex predator of the Amazon terrestrial environment, will occasionally take a young or small anaconda, but is extremely cautious around large adults. There are documented cases of large anacondas killing jaguars. There are also documented cases of jaguars killing large anacondas. When these two apex predators meet, the outcome depends on circumstances, size, surprise, terrain, health. There is no consistent winner. They coexist in a state of mutual wariness that speaks to the specific predatory power of each species. The most consistent threat to adult anacondas in the modern Amazon is human activity, not direct hunting, though that occurs in some areas, but habitat loss, which is the quiet and systematic destruction of everything an animal needs to live. The Amazon is being cleared at rates that have varied over the decades, but that have never in the modern era stopped entirely. The flooded forests that anacondas depend on for shelter and ambush. The river margins that provide the warm, shallow, prey-rich habitats where anacondas hunt and breed. The connected landscape that allows individual animals to move between populations and maintain genetic diversity. All of it is under pressure from agriculture, from cattle ranching, from logging, from the infrastructure of roads and dams that open previously inaccessible areas to further development. The anaconda does not understand deforestation. It does not know that the reed bed where it has hunted for 15 years is gone because a cattle ranch needed more pasture. It knows only that it cannot find food where it used to find food, that the territory it has memorized over a decade of living does not provide what it needs anymore, that it must move further and further to find the margins and the shallow water, and the dense vegetation that are not just preferences but requirements. And when it moves, it crosses roads and cleared land and passes through villages, and the encounter between a very large snake and a human being who has not grown up in a culture of coexistence with very large snakes typically ends badly for the snake. The relationship between Amazonian indigenous communities and the anaconda is one of the most complex and interesting human-animal relationships in the world, and it is one that the broader world almost never hears about in any detail. For the communities that have lived in the Amazon for thousands of years, the anaconda is not simply a dangerous animal to be feared or killed. It is a being with cultural significance so deep that it is woven into cosmology, into ritual, into the understanding of what the world is and how it works. In many Amazonian indigenous traditions, the anaconda is associated with rivers and water in a way that reflects precise ecological observation. It is the lord of the water, the master of the flooded world, the creature that mediates between the terrestrial and aquatic realms. Among the Yanomami people of the Venezuela-Brazil border region, the Dasana people of the Colombian Amazon, the various Tupian peoples of the Brazilian lowlands, and dozens of other Amazonian nations, the anaconda appears in creation myths, in accounts of the origin of the world and the origin of human beings, in stories of shamanic transformation and healing. The specific details vary enormously between traditions, as they do between any distinct cultures, but the recurrence of the anaconda as a significant mythological figure across independent traditions throughout the Amazon basin reflects something real, an animal so large, so powerful, so omnipresent in the waterways that define life in the flooded forest that it was impossible for any human culture embedded in that landscape to ignore it or treat it as ordinary. Shamans in many Amazonian traditions are understood to have a special relationship with anacondas, to be able to communicate with them, to take on their form, to travel through the water world that the anaconda inhabits. The ayahuasca visions that are central to many Amazonian spiritual practices frequently include serpent imagery, and researchers who have tried to understand this have proposed that the serpent, specifically the anaconda, functions as a kind of symbolic bridge between the world as human beings normally experience it and the deeper or hidden world that shamanic practice seeks to access. This is not a simple or uncontested interpretation, and the communities involved have their own understandings of what these visions mean that may not map neatly onto Western academic frameworks, but the centrality of the anaconda to Amazonian spiritual life is not in question. It is documented across many independent sources and recognized even by the communities themselves as a defining feature of their cosmological world. The practical knowledge of anacondas held by Amazonian indigenous communities is also extraordinary. And it is worth dwelling on this for a moment because it represents a form of ecological intelligence that science is increasingly recognizing as valuable. Communities that have lived alongside anacondas for thousands of years know things about anaconda behavior and ecology that researchers with decades of field experience have only recently confirmed or have not yet confirmed at all. They know which water conditions anacondas prefer. They know how anaconda activity changes with the flood cycle. They know how to move through anaconda habitat without either provoking an encounter or alerting the snake to human presence, a form of behavioral knowledge refined through generations of shared landscape. They know, through accumulated observation rather than controlled experiment, that large anacondas in certain areas return to specific sites year after year, that they have home ranges and preferred hunting spots and behavioral regularities that can be learned and predicted if you know what to look for. This knowledge is not folklore in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. It is the product of thousands of years of careful observation by people who needed to understand their environment to survive in it, and who passed that understanding down through generations with the same care that any culture passes down its most important knowledge. And it is disappearing, for the same reasons that indigenous languages and traditional ecological knowledge everywhere are disappearing. The pressure of external cultures, the movement of young people to cities, the assumption embedded in dominant educational systems that the knowledge that matters is the knowledge that comes from books and laboratories rather than from the specific, patient, intergenerational observation of particular places and particular animals. Let us talk about the anaconda's role in the ecosystem, because this is where the importance of the animal extends beyond the spectacular and becomes foundational. Every apex predator shapes its ecosystem in ways that extend far beyond its direct prey, and the anaconda is no exception. By predating on capybaras, the anaconda prevents capybara populations from growing to the point where they overgraze the riverbank vegetation. Capybara overgrazing would destabilize the banks, increase erosion, change the character of the waterway, and reduce the habitat quality for dozens of other species that depend on intact riparian vegetation. By predating on caimans, the anaconda affects caiman population dynamics, which in turn affects the fish and invertebrate communities that caimans prey on. By predating on large fish, the anaconda influences the structure of aquatic communities in ways that ripple through the food web. Remove the anaconda from this system and the system does not simply continue with one fewer species. It reorganizes, often in ways that are difficult to predict and that tend to be unstable. The prey populations of apex predators have a tendency, when the predator is removed, to increase until they hit some other limiting factor, often food availability or disease, and then to crash. A boom-bust cycle that is ecologically destabilizing compared to the slower, more regulated population dynamics that exist when a top predator is keeping prey numbers in check. The anaconda, as the dominant large predator of the flooded forest and riverine margins of the Amazon, is doing ecological work that keeps the system around it in a state of balance that has persisted for millions of years. It is, in the truest sense of the term, a keystone species. The flooded forest itself deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it is one of the most extraordinary and least understood habitats on Earth, and the anaconda is one of its most characteristic inhabitants. During the flood period, which can last 4 to 6 months in some parts of the Amazon basin, the forest floor disappears under meters of water and the entire character of the habitat transforms. Animals that were terrestrial become semi-aquatic. Animals that were aquatic move into spaces that were terrestrial. The boundary between water and land, which organizes so much of ecological thinking, dissolves. Fish swim between the roots of trees, eating fallen fruits and seeds. River dolphins, the pink bodo and the gray tucuhi, move into the forest hunting fish that have dispersed into the flooded understory. Monkeys and sloths and other arboreal animals remain in the canopy, now effectively stranded on islands of green above a vast shallow lake. Caiman move into the forest and hunt. And the anaconda, supremely comfortable in the slow warm water, moves through the flooded forest like a resident returning to a familiar home, because that is exactly what is happening. The anaconda hunts differently in the flooded forest than it does in open water. In the flooded forest, the vertical vegetation, the trunks and roots and fallen branches that structure the space, provides opportunities for ambush that do not exist in open water. An anaconda can drape itself along a submerged log or coil among the roots of a large tree in water that is colored dark by tannins, nearly invisible to anything approaching through the water. It can position itself along routes that animals use when moving through the flooded forest, paths that exist in 3 dimensions here, through the water and above it and around the obstacles of the forest structure. The anaconda learns these routes. It patrols them. It waits at them. The patience of a hunting anaconda in the flooded forest is something that operates on a time scale so different from human perception of time that it takes a particular kind of attention to appreciate it. Research on anacondas in the wild is extraordinarily challenging for reasons that anyone who has thought about it for a moment will immediately understand. The habitat is difficult to access, vast, and disorienting. The animals are cryptic, spending most of their time submerged or in dense vegetation. Tracking requires either radio telemetry, which means catching the animals to attached transmitters, or visual observation, which requires the researcher to be in the water, in anaconda habitat, looking for a very large animal that is specifically evolved to be difficult to see. The encounters between researchers and anacondas in the course of fieldwork are invariably described as intense experiences, and the accounts of researchers who have caught and measured large anacondas in the wild contain a quality of slightly stunned respect that even the most careful scientific writing cannot entirely conceal. Jesus Rivas, a Venezuelan-born herpetologist who has spent more time studying wild anacondas than perhaps any other researcher, has described the experience of working with large anacondas in the llanos of Venezuela, the seasonally flooded grasslands south of the Orinoco River that provide some of the best anaconda habitat in South America, in terms that give a sense of what encountering these animals on their own terms actually feels like. The sheer physical experience of handling a large anaconda, the weight of it, the strength of the constricting coils even when the animal is not attempting to kill you but simply attempting to hold onto something stable, the way the animal's body seems to encompass you to wrap around a situation is something that researchers describe as genuinely humbling. Not frightening, for those who know what they are doing, but humbling. As an encounter with something very old and very powerful and very fully realized as what it is. The largest anacondas that have been reliably measured in the wild by researchers tend to fall in the range of 5 to 7 meters. The 7-meter animals, the ones at the top of the reliably documented size range, are typically old females in prime condition, animals that have been growing for 20 years or more. When Rivas and his colleagues catch a large female for measurement and radio tagging, the process requires multiple experienced people, because an animal of this size and strength cannot be safely handled by fewer than 4 or 5 people working together, and even then the process is controlled chaos. The snake attempting to move in the direction of water while the researchers attempt to measure and process it and do their work without injuring the animal or each other. The anaconda does not have the behavioral repertoire of a mammal. It does not have the facial expressions, the vocalizations, the social signals that we use to read the intentions of other mammals. It has posture and movement and chemical signals that are largely invisible to us. When a large anaconda turns toward you in shallow water, it is genuinely difficult to read whether it is simply reorienting toward what its heat-sensing pits have detected, which is a warm mammal, or whether it is preparing to strike. The ambiguity of the anaconda's behavioral signals is part of what makes encounters with them feel so charged, so different from encounters with large mammals, where we have at least some intuitive ability to read what the animal is about to do next. With an anaconda, you are reading a very different kind of being, and the reading is hard. The question of whether anacondas are dangerous to humans is one that has been generating stories, myths, and genuine scientific debate for as long as Europeans have been in the Amazon, which is to say for about 500 years, during which period the quality of the information has varied enormously. The genuine scientific consensus is this: anacondas are capable of killing and consuming a human being. This is not a myth, it is a physical fact about the size and strength of the animal. Whether they do so regularly, habitually, as a preferred prey choice is a completely different question, and the answer to that question is definitively no. Adult humans are large, upright, and equipped with tools, and anacondas in the wild typically avoid confrontation with animals that are not clearly identified as prey. Anacondas that have encountered humans and had neutral or negative experiences, which means any anaconda that has encountered indigenous hunters or researchers who know what they are doing, tend to be more avoidant rather than more aggressive. The verified cases of anacondas attacking humans are real but relatively rare, and they typically involve either very large snakes in areas where they have had little exposure to humans, juveniles defending themselves when cornered, or specific circumstances like a person entering the water in an area where a large anaconda was actively hunting. The fatality rate from anaconda attacks compared to the fatality rate from other large dangerous animals in the same habitat, including electric eels, bull sharks that penetrate the Amazon system, Africanized bees, and the bacteria and parasites of the water itself, is very low. The anaconda is genuinely dangerous in the way that anything very large and very strong is genuinely dangerous, but it is not a man-eater in the systematic sense that the mythology insists upon, and treating it as one tells us more about human psychology and the appeal of the monstrous than it does about anaconda behavior. What the anaconda is magnificent, and I want to use that word precisely, not as hyperbole, but as an accurate description of what the animal represents when you stand back far enough from the mythology and the fear response to look at it clearly. It is magnificent the way a mature old-growth tree is magnificent, not because it is doing anything spectacular or dramatic in the moment you encounter it, but because it represents the product of an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of process. An organism so fully realized, so completely fitted to its place and its role, that the rightness of it is almost architectural. The green anaconda belongs to the Amazon the way the anaconda belongs in the river. Without it, something essential is missing, and the shape of everything around it changes in ways that take time to become visible but that are nevertheless real. There is a moment that researchers who have spent time in anaconda habitat describe, always in slightly different words but always pointing at the same experience. You are in the water, in shallow, warm, dark water at the edge of the flooded forest, and you are moving slowly watching, and the light is coming through the canopy above in shafts that illuminate certain patches of water and leave others in deep shadow. And the sounds of the forest are enormous, insects and birds and the distant splash of something in the channel, and you are not quite sure where the surface ends and the submerged vegetation begins, and then something moves, not fast, not suddenly, slowly. A shifting of the pattern of the water, a reorientation of something that you were not even aware of as a presence until it moved, and you realize that what you are looking at, what you have been looking at for some time without seeing it, is an anaconda, and it is large, and it is close, and it is looking at you. And in that moment, the million years of primate evolution that sit in your brainstem take over briefly and tell you very clearly, and without any nuance whatsoever, that you are in the presence of something that can eat you. And then the conscious mind catches up and does its work, reminding you of everything you know, the behavior of the animal, the context, the fact that it has not moved toward you, the fact that it is simply there, watching, doing what it always does, which is observe and assess and decide. And the fear and the awe and the recognition and the respect all arrive at once, and you are left standing in warm, dark water in the flooded forest of the Amazon, in the presence of the largest snake on Earth, and you are genuinely not sure what you are feeling, but you are absolutely certain that you are alive in a way that you rarely are in the rest of your life. That is what the anaconda does, that is what the Amazon does. It makes you feel the full weight of being a living thing in a world of living things where you are not the largest, not the strongest, not the most ancient, not the most perfectly fitted to the place where you stand. Where you are simply one creature among an almost incomprehensible diversity of creatures, all of them shaped by the same process over the same unimaginable span of time, all of them as real and as fully realized in their own terms as you are in yours. The Amazon basin holds approximately 1 in 10 of all species on Earth. Let that sit for a moment. 1 in 10. Of all the species that exist on this planet, in all the oceans, in all the grasslands, in all the deserts, in all the forests, in all the polar regions, in all the mountain ranges, in all the coral reefs combined, 1 in 10 of them lives in this one river basin in South America. The number of named species is in the hundreds of thousands. The number of unnamed, undescribed species that have never been formally identified or studied by scientists, is estimated to be in the millions. Millions of species in one river basin, most of them unknown to science. Every year that researchers go into the Amazon, they bring back species that no one has ever described before, that no formal name has ever been given, that have been living there in the darkness and the water and the canopy and the soil for millions of years without human awareness of their existence. The world's biggest snake.